In the Old West, kindness could be mistaken for weakness, but when a lone cowboy gave water to a starving Apache boy, he had no idea his choice would summon 100 warriors to his ranch by sunrise. This is the story of mercy, danger, and the night when one act of compassion nearly sparked a war. Part 1: The Stranger at the Well. The desert measured time and thirst. It was the kind of clock that didn't tick so much as scrape, a rasp on the throat, a stitch in the ribs, a white heat that painted the horizon with wavering lies. Elias Carter, called Dust by most folks who could not remember the rest of his name, had learned to live by that measure. Dawn meant the windmill would complain, and the coffee would taste like boiled saddle. Noon meant the nail in the fence post would bend where the grain pushed back, and the sweat in his hatband would salt his eyes until the world blurred and then came stubbornly clear again. Evening meant the coyotes would call in two voices, one for family, one for hunger, and the little cabin would lean a fraction more against the horizon, as if it wanted to fall into it and be done. His place was a square of land that no one would fight him for. The soil went to dust when a man looked at it wrong. The grass grew in tough little fists. The well gave iron-tanged water only when coaxed like a skittish colt. There was a corral with 2 rails missing, and a gate that stuck on a splinter every other morning. The bay mare had a temper that came and went with the moon. The mule had no temper at all, which was worse. On the shelf over the table sat a tin photograph in a little wood frame that Elias had sanded smooth until it felt like bone. A woman with river-dark eyes looked back at him from that tin, and a boy with a grin that made his ears look too small crowded her shoulder. Elias touched the frame every morning, as if waking, and every night as if saying good night, and between those 2 touches he went about the business of keeping himself alive. The morning it happened, he had started early. There was a wind that had come up in the night, a soft east wind that smelled not of rain but of something washed far away. He listened to it for a time and decided it meant nothing. The way a man decides a dream means nothing, because to decide otherwise is to let it set your day. He mended a strap with a needle that had dulled to the exact degree of his patience. He scraped the black from the coffee pot with a stick. He found the mule's hoof had picked up a stone and coaxed it free with a curse and a biscuit. In the thin light he set his shoulder to a fence post that wouldn't square and pushed until his breath came hard and the post decided to remember its duty. He was thinking of nails when the shimmer out past the wash stopped being shimmer and gathered itself into a boy. At first, the boy looked like a jackrabbit to him, low, darting, sideways more than straight. Then the outline found its bones, and Elias saw a child about 10, or perhaps younger if hunger had stolen inches from him. The boy was walking in a way that wasn't a walk so much as a refusal to fall. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, his lips had split and glossed with a dry shine. The horizon leaned behind him as if trying to take him back, but he kept moving toward the well, because thirst is a law older than fear. Elias let his hand drift close to the rifle that leaned against the post. He did not pick it up. In this country a man could live a long time by reaching for iron first, but he could live longer in his own mind by knowing when not to. He stepped away from the rifle so the boy could see it wasn't in his hand, and he raised his palms the way men do when they want to speak in a language no one can misunderstand. The boy lifted his own hand and tapped his mouth. Then he pointed to the well. The gesture was not begging and not asking either. It was more like truth. Elias turned the crank. The rope rasped across the spindle. The pulley squealed. The bucket took its time descending, and then kissed the water with a sound that made the day feel bearable. When he hauled it up he did it slow, so the water would not leap out as if trying to become cloud again. He poured into the dipper. The boy took it in both hands. He did not gulp. He set the tin to his lips, and let the water happen to him in small swallows, counting something invisible between each. Whoever had taught him that had saved his life before Elias ever laid eyes on him. Little at a time, Elias said, because words need a place to go, even if they are only there to keep a man honest with himself. The boy finished and looked into the cup as if there might be a second drink inside the first. Elias dipped again. The boy drank again. When the light in his eyes changed from a feverish flat to a visible shine, Elias tore a strip of jerky and pressed it into the boy's palm. The boy chewed like a person who had not often been given meat unasked. He kept his gaze on Elias's hands, as if ready for them to turn into something else. Then his knees unlocked and went wrong. Elias caught him under the arm and felt how light he was. Dry wood weighed more. He carried him inside and set him on the chair by the window. The chair had one leg shorter than the rest. He had meant to fix that for a month and not done it. He pushed a folded rag under that leg, and made the chair level. The boy watched this operation with more attention than most men gave a saddle cinch. He was trembling, which might have been fear but felt more like a body noticing that it had stopped dying for the moment, and no longer knew what to do with itself. Elias warmed beans with water, until they stopped pretending to be stones. He cut the heel from yesterday's bread, and softened it against the steam. The boy ate slowly, as if the food might disappear if he were rude. Between bites, his hand floated to his throat and touched something under the ragged shirt. He seemed not to notice he was doing it. The gesture reminded Elias of the way a man who has lost a wedding ring still twists the finger for years after. When the boy dozed, Elias saw what he had been reaching for. The necklace was not the cheap trash the peddlers sold to boys in town. The beads were bone and shell and stone threaded in a pattern that did not repeat. Its symmetry was larger than the length you could see. There was a little plate of hammered silver in the middle, oval as a thumbprint, with a mark on it that remembered a wolf's head without drawing one. Elias had seen that mark once before on a knife hilt that a freighter had traded for flour and tobacco, and a lie about where he'd come by it. Men in Las Piedras had spoken the name that night with their voices lowered, the way men lower their voices for God and for dangers they respect. Gray wolf. Elias felt a slow, deliberate tightening in the skin of his back. He looked at the boy streaked with dust, breathing even now, the loose line of his mouth relaxing, and tried to imagine a story that ended with no one riding into his yard. He could not. There were stories in this country that happened whether a man decided to be in them or not. He reached and gently turned the silver piece over between his fingers. The edge had been worn smooth by the thumb of someone who had counted days with it. He let the medallion fall back, and the boy's hand rose and covered it, not waking, not even stirring in any visible way except for that. Elias drew the blanket to the boy's chest and stood. He went to the shelf and took down the tin photograph and held it the way he always held it, lightly, as if too much grip would smudge the faces away. The woman in it would never know this child, and the child in it would never grow to the size of the boy in the chair, but standing there in that small house the three of them arranged themselves inside his heart to make a weight that steadied him. He set the picture down and stepped outside into the noon. The light hammered everything flat. The yard seemed at once too open and too small. He watered the mule and the mare, then set himself to work, because work could sometimes talk louder than worry. He dug out the stubborn rock under the fence post, and reset the post, tamping with the heel of his boot, until the dirt accepted the shape. He shaved the splinter from the gate with the edge of his knife so that the latch caught and released like a well-taught breath. He turned his mind to the tasks as if they were a wall between him and the thing that was riding toward him. And for an hour, maybe two, they were. When he went back inside, the boy was awake and watching, not in the way a child watches an adult for permission, but in the way a person watches a place to learn its rules. His eyes moved along the lines of the room, turning corners, learning the sound the door made when it shut, the taste the air had where the sun reached and where it did not. He set his palm on the table as if testing how solid it meant to be today. Elias handed him a tin cup with a little water and saw how the boy's fingers curled around it, careful again, controlled. He saw the quick scan the boy made of Elias's face and hands before he lifted the cup, checking for danger, checking for cost. "What do they call you?" Elias asked, keeping his voice level, not trying to shape it into the boy's language, not filling it with the nonsense of men who get panicked by silence. The boy spoke a word. It carried across the room softly, like a shadow that never meant to be caught. Elias tried it back and the boy nodded, not because Elias had said it perfectly, but because he had tried to say it and meant the trying. He said his own name then. The boy listened to it and glanced, for the first time, toward the shelf where the tin photograph sat, as if the sound had pointed that way. "You can eat," Elias said. "You can rest. You're safe in this room." The boy looked toward the door at the word safe, and the corner of his mouth bent in the way a smile bends when it knows better. He was not ungrateful. He was not convinced. He was practical, the way the land makes children practical. They fell into a work that needed no speech. Elias cut kindling. The boy stacked it in a tight square that would not fall over. Elias wiped the stove. The boy rinsed the rag in the bucket and wrung it with a twist that left no drops to waste. Elias set out a plate and knife. The boy moved the cup out of the way of the blade without looking at his own hand do it. It was what living with other people does to a human being, even when he has not had much of it. It teaches you to make room. When the heat began to bend toward evening, the wind changed. A smell rode it that did not belong to Elias's yard. Mesquite, and something resinous pignon, perhaps burning somewhere too far to see and too near for comfort. Elias stepped to the edge of the porch and listened. Sound travels differently in that hour. It doesn't hurry. It lays itself down and waits for a man to trip over it. He heard nothing at first but the familiar grasshoppers, the ticking of wood cooling in the sun, a hawk slicing the air. Then, under that, a slow throb, low as the ground. It came and went at first, like the heart of a big animal across a room. It did not belong to the windmill. It did not belong to anything in his yard. It belonged to men who had decided something, and were on their way to make that decision into a shape other people could not ignore. The boy came to the door without being called. He stood with one shoulder on the jamb and did not cross the threshold, as if there were a rule about such things. He listened with his whole body the way Elias had seen a horse listen right before rain. When the sound swelled again, the boy's face changed. He did not look afraid. He looked like a person who hears his name from a distance and knows the voice that spoke it. Elias did not say it aloud, but the thought walked through him and sat down without asking. Drums. In Las Piedras, there were men who could imitate that sound with their hands on a table. Boys did it when they wanted to scare other boys into running to their mothers. It never worked. Not the way fear does when it comes honest. What rolled across the flats now was not noise and not show. It was a pulse of a people who had measured their grief and their patience and their fury, and found a cadence that fit all three. The boy raised his hands and began to count. Not the way a white schoolboy would 1, 2, 3, but in a way that carried the meaning without needing the numbers. 10, he showed, then 20, then 30. His fingers went wide and folded and went wide again. The sound under the world paced with him. Elias understood the math because a man who keeps cattle in this country learns to count in groups he can imagine from the saddle. 100. Then some, enough to make the ground notice. He felt the strange calm that comes when trouble is too big to pretend away. He brought the boy back inside, and set the bar across the door, though he knew how small a protection that was. He lit the lamp low and set a plate on the table and did not eat from it. He took the photograph down and looked at the face at a canter and checked his horse hard enough to make the animal toss its head in protest. He had young shoulders and an old fury. The lance in his hand had never rested long. Men behind him murmured a name that Elias did not yet know, but would. Red Hawk. Red Hawk's words came hot, first in Apache, then in English sharp enough to be the same. He called Elias a thief. He called him a desecrator. He called him a fool who had kept what did not belong to him in order to buy safety with a child's body. He did not spit. He did not need the help of the dust to make his contempt visible. He turned in the saddle and spoke a phrase that was not a request. 100 bowstrings rose and took their places on 100 bows with a sound that made the hair on Elias's arms stand of its own accord. The boy moved without thinking about courage. He threw himself in front of Elias, with his arms wide, small body making a gait where there should have been none. His voice found every word it knew and used them. He told what had happened, stripped of the kind of dressing men put on events to justify what they wanted to do next. He said water and bread and chair and sleep, and the way the blanket had been set over him like a roof a human hand could make. He said the name of the necklace and the name of the man who had touched it with respect and not greed. Gray Wolf's jaw flexed once. Red Hawk's nostrils flared. The riders held their positions because discipline is a kind of belief you practice until it continues without your permission. Elias felt the sun on the back of his neck, and thought about how men talk about heat when they don't have anything useful left to say. He kept his hands up. He did not attempt to set his words against the boys. There are times a man can ruin a truth by adding to it. Gray Wolf raised one hand. The circle breathed differently. Arrows eased a hair. Red Hawk's lance point lowered the length of a fingernail. Gray Wolf spoke then, in English that had been learned not from school but from the human need to be understood across a line drawn by someone else. He said that he had buried men because of lies and because of truths and because of the difference between the two, and that he did not intend to bury anyone today without knowing which this was. He said that words on the wind were thin things, and that a man who had done what Elias said he had done should be able to show the shape of it in daylight without trembling. He said Elias would prove his words or he would die where he stood. He said it in the tone of a man who had been obeyed for a long time because he had earned the right to be. There was nothing in Elias's pockets that could prove a kindness to men who had come with their grief sharpened to points. There was only the chair in his cabin, the dipper at his well, the pot where the beans had softened, the blanket he had set over a sleeping child, the photograph of a woman and a boy who belonged to a life the desert had taken back. He thought of those objects, and realized how little and how much they were. He looked at the boy. The boy looked back as if saying, "This is the part where the truth has to walk on its own legs." Elias lowered his hands by a fraction, enough to reach toward his shirt pocket very slow, so careful that the air could not mistake the movement for anything else. A tremor rode the circle, the way a horse will consider bolting and then think better of it. He brought out a small scrap of cloth caught with a splinter from the fence the boy had brushed against when his legs had given out. There was a smudge of the same dust that was on all of them, and a thread that matched the tear in the boy's shoulder. He did not offer it forward because there was no forward to offer to. He held it at chest height, not like a trophy, not like a ransom token. Grey Wolf looked at it, and then at the boy's torn shirt, and then at the piece of silver lying against the little brown chest, and the pattern of beads that said larger things than any one man's day could contain. His gaze returned to Elias and rested there. All around them the morning widened as if meaning to take them all in. The desert made a blue of the sky that was almost painful. The light sharpened edges until even dust had a shadow. A lark rose from scrub and thought better of whatever it had been going to sing. The world arranged itself to witness. Elias felt the shape of what would follow and knew there were only two routes through it. One was blood. One was something more difficult and more rare, which men called mercy when they were feeling kind and weakness when they were not. He could not choose for them. He could only refuse to flee the choosing. He breathed, and let the air go, and waited for judgment to find its voice. And that was how the morning ended and the next began, with a man in an empty yard and a boy who belonged to more than one truth, and a ring of riders who had decided to come as close to war as they could without yet making it. The desert kept its own counsel. The drums were silent for now. The decision would not be. Part 2. Rumors and Drums. The wind turned before noon, and with it the mood of the land. It came from the south now, low and steady, carrying the faint scent of resin and ash as if trees had been persuaded to remember fire. Elias Carter paused with his hand on the gate latch, and put his face into that wind, the way a man puts his face into river spray after a long ride. It was not relief. It was a notice. Old Ben arrived with dust around him like a veil he had torn out of the road. His mare clattered into the yard, throwing her head as if arguing about being asked to run in this heat. Ben swung down without grace, and without apology. His hat brim threw his eyes into shadow until he tipped it back, and then the worry there made him look younger and older at the same time, like a boy playing at his father and a father who had mislaid his boy. "Tell me you didn't," he said, voice flat as a card laid face down. He didn't waste time on which you or what didn't. The yard had too many eyes for that window glass. Nailheads. The black knot in the gatepost that watched everything. Elias didn't reach for the lie that would have been kindness to neither of them. Boy staggered to my well. I gave him water and bread. Ben's gaze shot toward the open door, then back. What's on his neck? Elias didn't say the name. Names change a thing's shape when they're spoken out loud, and some shapes can't be put back. He let the silence answer. Ben exhaled on a curse that ran out of air halfway through and left the rest of it implied. Grey Wolf, he said anyway. Not some camp boy. Not a nephew. His blood. He lifted his hand and held his thumb and forefinger a breath apart. One son, that's all. And he's on your chair. Elias thought of the boy's hand traveling to the medallion even in sleep. He thought of the way the child had counted with his fingers, when the drums were still only a ghost in the wind. He thought of the photograph on the shelf, the tin gone soft at the edges, the flowers brittle and stubborn around it. Then, he thought of the yard full of riders he could feel coming the way you can feel rain on your skin before the first drop hits. I couldn't turn him out, he said. It wasn't apology. It wasn't defense. It was the axis his day had begun to turn on, and it was too late to build a different instrument to measure it by. Ben scrubbed a palm down his face, dragging years into a line from temple to jaw. Then, by God, be a man who understands the bill that follows. You've seen smoke? Elias nodded. Pinon and mesquite. They're talking to each other, Ben said. Hills to hills. Folks in town saw it from the churchyard and pretended they were looking at clouds. I cut across the Arroyo Blanco to shave time. Thought maybe I'd talk sense into you. He slanted a look that needed no translation. Ain't much sense in a man who's already decided how he wants to live with his shadow. Likely not, Elias said. He felt the small tug in his chest that came whenever Ben said something that landed truer than comfort. "What would you have me do?" "Ride him out before the light quits," Ben said. "Not into their arms, but into their sight. Hands high. Let him run the last. You get to go on breathing another day, and they get to go on believing their story about us isn't a total lie." He swallowed and added, quieter, "Or you can make for Las Piedras and sleep in the cross-eyed coyote with your boots on, while the rest of us wait to see if our roofs still belong to us in the morning." Elias looked past Ben to the line of low hills where the shadow gathered like a council. He thought of roofs in flames. He thought of cattle pushed out of pens and scattered to make a point. He thought of men who had done nothing braver than sharpen words into reasons, and then woke to discover those words had no edge on them at all when the world came to collect. "I'll take him toward them when dawn lets us see who we're talking to," Elias said. "I won't cut the dark with a hope and call it a plan." Ben opened his mouth to argue and then shut it and took refuge in a different truth. "All right, but don't kid yourself, Elias. What you did this morning decided more than breakfast." He mounted up and let the mare dance in a half circle because she wanted to, then turned her nose toward the trace. He didn't ride off right away. "Do you want me to send anyone?" "No," Elias said. "If men come here tonight, they ought to be men who came because they had to, not because somebody asked them to stand between me and the consequence of my choices." Ben looked at him for a long beat, with that old familiar impatience that was really an affection that had been dried by weather and cut into pieces small enough to swallow. "I'll leave a lantern in the window," he said. "You see 3 in a row in town. It means we heard a thing we can't pretend otherwise about." He switched the reins into his left hand. "And Elias?" "What?" "Lock your door if it makes you feel like a door can keep the night out. But don't put your back to it. Men die stupid with a bar across their shoulders." Elias nodded. Ben rode away until his shape was a piece of the heat, and then a trick of light, and then memory. Inside, the boy had woken again, though he kept still the way creatures do when they've learned that sound costs. His eyes tracked Elias's movements without looking like they did. He saw the canteen screwed tight, the pistol checked and returned to its place, the chair pulled closer to the wall so that a person sitting in it could see both door and window, by turning only his head. He lifted his hand once and touched the silver again, then took it away as if telling himself not to need the habit. Elias set a plate and broke bread beside beans he'd coaxed into something deserving the name. The boy ate the way he had earlier, with a discipline that felt like more than manners. When he finished, he took the plate to the bucket, rinsed it down, set it upside down on the table's edge, and waited without fidgeting for what would happen next. Elias wondered who had taught him to make a life inside the rules of another person's house, and then understood the lesson wasn't about houses at all. It was about survival. The day dragged its heat into afternoon like a carcass being pulled across sand. The mare dozed with one hind leg cocked, tail switching flies in a rhythm that made the hours measurable. The mule worked a piece of salt with the patience of a saint who had decided the only job worth doing in this life was to keep existing. Far off, a hawk's whistle showed itself, and then shut. The wind moved across the wash with a sound like paper being folded and unfolded and folded again. Elias tried to read the sky for rain, and found only the story the desert wrote most days. You will be given light, and not water. You will be given heat, and not mercy. He made himself busy anyway, because hands that are doing can keep a mind from wandering into rooms it doesn't need to enter. He scraped the soot from the stove's throat. He mended a tear in the old tarp that lived under the wagon seat. He retwisted a length of wire that had unlearned its work. Between each chore he checked the horizon the way a man checks a door he knows he already locked. When the sun began to lower itself with the slow arrogance of a king who has made people wait before, the first clean sound of the drums reached them without anyone's permission. It was not a roll. It was a statement, and then another, so evenly spaced that the land had to make room for them. The boy came to the doorway and stood there, and Elias did not need to be told what he was hearing. In town, the sound of a drum is a thing you can put on a shelf and take down for parades and independence. Out here, when it travels that far and still reaches you round and whole, the sound carries more than its own weight. It carries a rival. It carries an argument that does not require your agreement. The boy's chest rose and fell once like a man about to dive into cold water. He did not move otherwise. The light peeled back from his face and showed how young he was and how old. Elias felt that odd tenderness that comes on a man sometimes, not when someone is weak but when someone is composed beyond their years. He wanted to say it's all right and knew it wouldn't be, not in the way words mean all right when men use them carelessly. He wanted to say, "I am here," and managed, instead, to stand near. The sound did not hurry. It made the miles short. It set itself against the night like men laying up stones against a flood. Between beats, the world could be heard again, the scrape of a beetle at the threshold, the faint complaint of the windmill, the cough of a cow in someone else's pasture far enough away to be memory. Then the next beat arrived and the world stepped aside. As evening narrowed, the sky tried on purple and then decided on blue-black. Elias lit the lamp and turned the wick down until the flame was the size of truth. He set the plate on the shelf for morning, because men still wake hungry on the nights that matter most. And he looked to the boy and lifted 2 fingers toward the bedstead, and the blanket folded at its foot. The boy shook his head in a small, hard motion, and Elias accepted the answer, because insisting on rest is a kind of insult when a person has better reasons to remain upright. They didn't talk, there wasn't a common language, and there wasn't anything worth saying in any language that would change what was coming. The boy's eyes drifted now and then to the photograph. Once he reached, not toward the picture, but toward the ring of dried flowers around it. He didn't touch them. He hovered his hand above them as if testing the air there for temperature. Then he drew back. Elias wondered if grief has a smell, and if that was what the boy was measuring. Much later, when the lamp had burned down to a teardrop, the boy made a gesture with his right hand. A straight line moving forward, a stop, a circle drawn in the air. Elias had the sense to see it for a map. He nodded and traced it back to him. They would ride at first light to the place where the riders would make their circle. The boy nodded once in return, and Saturday, the drums shifted in the deepest part of the night. Their cadence widened, as if space had changed size somewhere out there. Under them came a thread of sound that was not voice and not instrument, the murmur men make when the course of a day has been altered by men speaking, and they must now make the alterations fit inside supper. Children went back to pretending not to stare. Dogs sorted out the gossip. Grey Wolf did not dismiss Elias. He made a place for him by standing where he could be seen and not seen at the same time. Red Hawk took up a position where his shadow fell long and made a straight line that a man would be careful not to cross. The boy stayed near Elias for a few breaths and then moved outward like the first ripple from a thrown stone, letting himself be touched on the shoulder by people who needed to touch him once so their hands could forget sooner. When they rode back, the escort was smaller. It was not a sign of lowered care. It was the opposite. A promise is lighter to carry than a threat. Men can travel with fewer companions when they are escorting an agreement because the road itself helps. They moved down out of the hills by a route that made the land feel less like a puzzle and more like a fact. Dusk took them halfway home and then turned the rest of the way into night. Elias did not hurry. He did not dawdle. The boy rode behind the saddle again with his palms on the mare's ribs, and the horse reached her head toward him once to take his smell into her memory. The stars came in their proper places as if nothing on the ground had changed, which is one of the ways the sky keeps men from starting all the fights they might otherwise start out of pride. At the edge of Elias's yard, they stopped. There was no circle of riders now, no raised lances, no drums. The mule brayed once and made it sound like an opinion. The windmill turned twice and didn't complain. Somewhere far off, a coyote practiced the art of sounding like 3 coyotes. Elias felt the strangeness that comes after adrenaline leaves the body. It is a quieter thing than fear, but just as physical. He swung down and let the reins fall. The boy slid after him, and stood with his hand on the mare for a moment longer than he needed to, which is how people tell animals goodbye without saying the word. They went inside. The room had not changed itself while they were gone, which is a miracle any house can offer. Elias put the lamp on the table and lit it and turned the wick low, and then, because his hands were still remembering the council and needed to touch something that belonged to him, he lifted the photograph and looked into the old tin again. He set it down, and spoke not to the picture, not to the boy, but to the day. "We'll do it," he said. "We'll keep our word." The boy nodded once, as if the sentence were a prayer he knew the shape of. He touched the medallion, and then, for the first time since he had come into the cabin, he let his fingers brush the edge of the dried flowers around the frame. They crackled softly under his touch, and did not fall apart. That seemed to satisfy him. He went to the chair and sat and leaned back, and let his eyes close like someone who had just learned that closing them would not invite a hand to take something he could not get back. Outside, the night turned the color it always turns in this country when it decides to be kind, black as useful ink. No lantern burned in the window in town that Elias could see from his porch, not that he looked for long. He did not want to live by signals of fear. He wanted to live by the ordinary acts a man can promise to do, and then do again tomorrow. The drums did not begin again. The land rested from them, the way a man rests after a long day, not because the day is done, but because tomorrow will take its share, and no one wants to enter it already empty. Elias lay down on his bed without taking off his boots and found, to his surprise, that sleep came over him like shade you did not bargain for, and therefore feel grateful toward. He woke before dawn because women in photographs never sleep long enough to let a man turn lazy. He rose and set the kettle and scraped the stove and went to the door and stood on the threshold with nothing in his hands. The horizon was out there doing its work, which is to say, it was pretending to be a new thing and succeeding. Behind him the boy turned in the chair and drew the blanket closer as if the night had stepped back a pace, but not far enough to make him forget it would always be there. Elias looked at him and then looked at the day and understood, not with words, that life had changed in the house without the house changing at all. He stepped out and let the morning put grit on his teeth and cough into his chest the way it always did. He had fences to walk, and a mule to argue with, and a promise to keep that would be kept in inches, and in small pores and in chairs set level with a folded rag. He had the knowledge that somewhere in the hills a handful of men had said out loud that mercy could be stronger than fury if it stood long enough to prove it. He took that knowledge into his lungs with the rest of the air. Then he went to the well and turned the crank and listened for the sound the bucket makes when it kisses the surface and tells you the day is ready to begin. Part 3. The First Test of a Promise. The day after the drums fell silent, Elias Carter rose with the sense that quiet was lying to him. In the West, peace never stayed. It only leaned against the door until the next trouble shoved its way in. He stepped outside into a pale morning, the air already holding the memory of smoke. The boy followed him, alert, silent, eyes scanning the horizon the way a colt listens to distant thunder. Before long, old Ben rode up fast, his mare lathered. "Tommy's gone," he said without dismounting. "Mort's boy. They're saying the Apaches took him." Elias felt the words settle like grit in his teeth. Rumors traveled quicker than truth. Who's saying it? Sindown has wed. Mort himself. And half the town's glad to believe it. The boy stiffened beside Elias but said nothing. His hands curled once at his sides, then loosened. Elias looked at him, and then at Ben. Tracks? Boot prints. Small. Headed east to the creek. After that, the ground muddled. Mort found a scrap of red cloth and declared himself prophet. Elias cursed under his breath. Cloth can't testify. They rode out together. Elias, the boy, Ben, and Mort, with two men who carried more rage than reason. Mort's jaw looked like iron hammered wrong. Jeb, trailing at the edge, had guilt written across his shoulders, though Elias doubted Mort noticed. The tracks told the story Ben had said, small boots pressed deep, panic showing in the angles. At the creek, Clay had swallowed what came next. The red cloth dangled from a mesquite thorn like a flag waiting to be mistaken. Mort snatched it up, waving it like a warrant. "Savages," he spat. "This is proof enough." The boy crouched low, ignoring Mort's voice. His fingers hovered above the ground, reading marks no one else could see. He touched a slip where a heel had lost its promise, then pointed to the bank. Elias leaned closer and saw it too. Not drag marks, not a struggle, just a child scrambling down, misjudging Clay. But Mort wanted villains, not explanations. They lured him, he snapped. This is their trick. The boy only shook his head. He touched the cloth, pinched the hem between two fingers, and lifted it toward Elias. The edge was straight, even cut by a knife, not torn by thorn. Elias glanced at Tommy's shirt, and saw where the missing piece belonged. He said nothing yet. The truth would reveal itself in time. The trail pulled them into a narrow canyon, the kind that swallowed sound and returned it jagged. Halfway down, they found Tommy perched on a ledge above a pool of rainwater, wide-eyed, frozen. His boots skidded on slick rock. One wrong step from the fall. Mort shouted his son's name, voice booming like a blow. The echo struck Tommy, and the boy wobbled. Elias snapped his palm up, silencing Mort. He moved down the rock himself, steady, deliberate. He did not look heroic. He looked like a man bargaining with gravity. He reached the ledge, sat beside Tommy, let him breathe. Above, the Apache boy guided with small hand motions, whispering one word in English. Slow. Together, Elias and Tommy shifted, inch by inch, until the boy was steady enough to walk back. Relief came sudden as rain. Mort clutched his son, then spun his fury toward the Apache boy. "You led him here," Mort snarled. "Set the sign, left the cloth." The boy did not flinch. He lifted the fabric again, showed the clean cut, pointed to Tommy's shirt. His voice was quiet but firm. "Cut." Tommy, still trembling, admitted it. "I made a flag. For a boat," he mimed, tying the cloth to a stick, chasing it along the pool. His shame came not from mischief but from the terror of what nearly followed. Mort staggered under the weight of truth, too heavy for his anger to carry. He muttered but found no target. Elias did not press him. Shame was punishment enough. They took Tommy home, Mort saying little. The boy rode with his head bowed, though not in defeat, only in the recognition that mercy rarely wins applause. Elias thought it might end there, but the desert had other plans. Smoke rose on the horizon. Fire. At the Johnson place, panic ruled. Mrs. Johnson wrestled quilts. Mr. Johnson dug useless trenches. Children sobbed for a puppy darting through the chaos. Elias wasted no words. He ordered, "Dig a fire break, soak the quilts, keep the girls busy counting the puppy's runs." Then he and the Apache boy set their own blaze a backfire, a dangerous salvation. Smoke clawed their throats, heat scorched their arms, but the fire line held. The racing inferno faltered, turned, and veered away. The house stood. The Johnson girls wept tears of relief. The puppy, finally caught, sagged into their arms. Dignity lost but life preserved. Elias coughed until his ribs hurt. The Apache boy poured water on a burn, expression flat, pain swallowed. Together they had beaten fire, but only for a while. Farther east, they found the blackened skeleton of a wagon, its iron bones twisted. No bodies, thank God, but the smell of burned leather lingered. The Apache boy read the ash, crouched low, pressed 2 fingers to a boot print. His verdict was clear. White men. Elias saw it: 2 heels cut from eastern boots, careless prints, the swagger of men who knew destruction was their trade. Bandits, not Apaches. But he also knew what Mort would claim. Smoke was a language liars spoke fluently. They rode hard for Grey Wolf's camp. The village was already bracing for blame warriors in place. Women steady, children silent. Red Hawk stood ready to ignite. Grey Wolf, calm as stone, waited. Elias told the truth of what he'd seen, each word plain, the boy filling gaps with gestures. Riders left at once to confirm, but Mort and others arrived soon, dragging their anger like a net. They accused, demanded vengeance, shouted about burned wagons and stolen children. The circle wavered, fury built. Red Hawk called for retaliation. Mort's voice stoked the flames. Elias stepped forward, refusing to let lies set fire to truth. "If you ride tonight, you'll strike neighbors, not the men who burned. You'll make the lie true, and once a lie becomes true, it cannot be undone." The Apache boy raised his voice then, louder than ever before. He mimed the dipper, the bread, the blanket. He spoke the words of mercy plain, words a child could carry but a council could not ignore. Silence fell. Grey Wolf looked at his son, then at Elias. "Mercy is not weakness," he said. "Weakness is forgetting why mercy exists." The circle broke. Red Hawk bowed stiffly, anger banked but alive. Mort muttered, defeated by facts but not yet changed. The fire of vengeance cooled for now, though embers smoldered. That night, Elias sat long by the dying fire. The boy leaned against him, medallion catching faint light. The desert was quiet again, but Elias knew it was only resting, not finished. He had kept his promise to stand here, wherever here was, and though judgment waited just beyond the horizon, for tonight at least, truth had survived the smoke. Part 4: The Fire Line. The weak bent toward heat the way iron bends toward a magnet, slow at first, then with a suddenness that makes you wonder if you imagined the slack before it. Morning came on hard. Elias Carter woke to the sound of the windmill complaining like an old man trying to tell a young day how it ought to behave. The boy was already up. He had swept the floor in strokes that left parallel lines a carpenter would have admired, and set the dipper where it wouldn't clatter. He had learned how the house liked to be itself. Elias stepped outside and let the air put grit on his teeth. The mare raised her head in a question. The mule watched the horizon and pretended he knew the answer. Sun pried at the edges of the land until color leaked out. The blue that makes distant hills look honest. The gold that tells weeds they are both ugly and holy. He checked the fence along the wash, found a place where a post had started to lean drunk, and set it right with a tamping that convinced the earth to take back its job. The boy followed with staples and wire, handing them without Elias needing to ask. Their silence was easy, the way a path gets easy after you've walked it enough to stop proving it is there. By mid-morning old Ben appeared, hat brim pulled down as if he were trying to keep rumors off his face. He didn't dismount. He didn't look as if he intended to. "You heard?" he asked, and made the question heavy enough to mean there were several possible answers and none of them were jokes. "No," Elias said. The boy stepped closer without seeming to. Ben's eyes flicked to him, and then returned to Elias, counting that new truth and moving on. "Mort's boy," Ben said. "Little Tommy. Went missing at dawn." He let the next sentence come like a cough. "They say Apaches took him." Elias felt the ground move a fraction under his boots. The way a wagon rut will fool a man into thinking the earth has decided to tilt. "They say," he repeated, buying time from repetition while his mind gathered the correct tools. "Who says?" "Mort," Ben said. "And anyone who would rather have a villain with a name they already know than admit the day might be complicated." He breathed out. "Tracks run east from Mort's yard, small boots, one set. Then muddle. Then a place where the creek cuts in and chews the ground until it won't hold a print. Mort found a strip of cloth caught on a mesquite thorn and declared court." Elias looked at the boy. The boy's eyes had narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, not in anger, more like a man squinting at a far fence to see if the top rail is true. "Color?" Elias asked Ben. "Red," Ben said. "But, Elias, it looked like a red you'd find on a white boy's Sunday shirt." He grimaced. "Which of course makes it worse for our purposes." Mort's voice carried long before his horse did. He came down the trace with 3 men behind him, and enough indignation in his jaw to power the windmill. He did not slow as he entered the yard. He pulled up so close the mare tossed her head, and Elias had to tell himself out loud not to take offense on her behalf. "You," Mort said. "Your friends have my boy." He threw the word friends as if it were a rotten apple, and wanted to see it burst against the wall. "I don't know where your boy is," Elias said. "You're going to find out," Mort said. "And you're going to fetch him back, or so help me I'll The sentence tripped on the lip of a threat, and fell into a pause where a man has to decide if he means to be brave, or only to sound like it. He recovered badly. "I'll see to it the council you like to quote so much meets again. Only this time every man brings rope." Old Ben put his horse slightly between Mort and Elias because the old man understood the geometry of anger. "Mort," he said mildly, "let's save the rope for cows." Mort ignored him the way a man ignores a screen door between himself and someone he means to shout at. He pointed at the boy. "He can be useful for once. He knows their tracks." The boy did not flinch, and did not answer. Elias felt pride and dread arrive together in his chest, like twins who do not always get along. "I'll help look," Elias said, "but I'll look with my own eyes." He turned to the boy. "We need your eyes too." He did not add "if you're willing." The boy had come to understand that being needed here was not another form of captivity. They set out. Elias, the boy, old Ben, Mort with his 2 men, and Jeb tagging along at the edge like a gilt that had learned to ride. The trail out of Mort's yard was as Ben had said, small boots anchoring panic to the ground. The toes pointed toward the creek, then hesitated, then turned east. A coyote had crossed there in the night. A rabbit had changed its mind twice. The earth keeps books dead, accountants would have killed to master. Elias read what he could, and handed the ledger to the boy when it stopped being written in his language. At the mesquite thorn the cloth hung as if it had been placed for a story. The boy looked at it, and then at the bark on a nearby cottonwood where a sliver of flesh had scraped. He smelled the air with a little flare of his nostrils that looked for a second like the mare reading wind. He crouched, pointed to a place where the dust had been pressed, and then let go, and made a small sound that meant boot heel and boot toe had both slipped here, not because someone had dragged a child, but because someone had climbed over the creek bank and miscalculated the generosity of clay. Mort said something about savages, and took the cloth from the thorn and bound it to his saddle horn like a banner. Elias said nothing because saying something would have wrecked the small, precise machine of attention the boy was using to build a line through uncertainty. They followed the creek until it ran out of itself under sand and memory. They followed the line of the cottonwoods, until the line veered toward a slot in the low hills. The slot was a place where a man could disappear if he wanted to be lost, and could be found if someone who loved him refused to let him. The boy paused at the mouth of it, and raised his hand for quiet though no one had spoken, and Elias had the sudden, absurd thought that if the boy raised his hand in the cross-eyed coyote, during a Saturday night fight, even Calder might lower his hammer for a minute to catch his breath. Inside the slot the air was cooler, and the light turned into a softer thing that made hard stone look touchable. The smooth walls rose on either side like the sides of a throat. A hawk's cry couldn't reach in here, neither could a council's. It was a place for secrets to decide whether they were still enjoying themselves. They found the boy Tommy halfway down. He was crouched on a ledge above a pool that had remembered rain longer than it ought to have. His eyes were wide in the particular way. Eyes go wide when they have been too full for too long and have forgotten how to close without leaking. His small boots were planted on rock that sloped toward a fall he would not have survived. He had a cut on his knee that had crusted into a badge of independence he would have bragged about in a safer world. He held his breath every few seconds as if making himself smaller would make the ledge wider. Mort saw him and shouted his name, and the shout wrapped itself around the stone and came back as a shove. Tommy wobbled. Both Mort and the boy, whose language had not been asked for, yet flung their hands up, Mort out of love, the boy out of expertise. Elias put his palm toward Mort and said, softly, "Don't," and put the other toward the boy and said nothing because he didn't need to. They both understood. Sound was a knife here. Elias went down first. He did not look brave. He looked like a man negotiating with the day. The rock leaned and pretended to be honest. He let his weight find purchase not by force but by the kind of attention you give a colt that wants to bolt but will stay if you talk to it with your shoulder. Halfway, he tested the ledge with his heel, and found where the stone had decided to be sand. He cursed the way a carpenter curses a board that has split because that kind of blasphemy is just information. Above, the boy was working without moving. He made small motions with his fingers to show Tommy what foot to move and what hand to secure. He found a word in English because a child's fear deserves comprehensible mercy. "Slow," he said. "Slow." Tommy nodded without taking his eyes off the water. Mort vibrated like a bowstring. Ben put a hand on Mort's bridle to steady the horse and steadied the man attached to it by accident. When Elias reached the ledge, he didn't reach for Tommy. He sat beside him. They breathed together for 3 counts, 1, 2, 3, and then Elias said, barely opening his mouth, "You and me." He didn't add "we'll walk." He didn't add now. He let the boy above say "slow" again, and let the weight of the word lay across them like a blanket that keeps a shiver from turning into a shake. They moved. Elias took the boy's belt in his fingers, not to pull, but to translate. Tommy's foot slid once and then remembered the floor was a promise you had to keep too. Elias turned so his body blocked the view of the fall, because a man can sometimes make fear go away by depriving it of witnesses. They reached the place where the ledge widened from cruel to merely unkind. Elias felt the sudden lightness in Tommy, as relief took weight back from terror. Above, the boy let out the breath he had been on loan for. Mort's hands finally stopped trying to throw themselves down to his son, and his face learned how to cry without tears. In the mouth of the slot, everything fractured into argument, as if the canyon had decided to make itself out of words now that stone had done its share. Mort grabbed his boy and then, because the hunger to blame can sometimes wear its love like a mask, turned on the Apache boy. "They lured him," he said. "They set sign. They left cloth. They—" "Mort," Ben said. Mort did not hear him. Where was he headed, huh? He don't wander out here alone unless he's following something he thinks is a game. He shook the scrap of red cloth like it had committed a sin by existing. The Apache boy took the cloth from Mort's hand. Not fast, not rough. He pinched it between thumb and forefinger like a specimen. He pointed to the hem. He made a small, precise sound and then found the English for what he needed. "Cut," he said. He slid his finger along the edge to show Morton. Straight, even, knife. He pointed to Tommy's shirt under his vest. The missing piece was a twin. Tommy, emboldened by survival and by the relief of understanding, piped up, "I cut it. For a flag." He swallowed and pointed down the slot. "For a boat." He showed with his hands how he had tied the cloth to a stick and launched it on the pool and watched it spin as the water pushed at it. He had chased it along the ledge and lost the ledge, and discovered that the bravery he thought he had brought with him was too small to carry both him and his idea back out. Silence shoved Mort backwards a step. Shame does that. It mimics impact. He looked at his son, and then at the Apache boy, and then at Elias, and for a moment did not know how to be in his own skin. He began to gather anger again because it is a tool men reach for when their hands have been surprised into admitting they are empty. Ben stood forward and said in a voice that had picked up a little of the canyon's authority, "Mort." Then, softer, "Take your boy home." Mort did. He left without a threat, which is sometimes a greater courtesy than followed. Was not a gunfight worth songs because gunfights worth songs are lies. It was a scuffle that turned serious too fast. Jeb fired too early, and it saved a man he had not meant to save by surprising him out of aiming for someone else's lung. Calder used the hammer in his hand for the thing it was made for, and then had to live with the sound it made against bone. Red Hawk's lance found the air, and then the ground, and then the ankle of a man who had not imagined a lance would find him today. And that surprise did more to change the outcome than any accuracy in the blow. Elias pushed a man off a horse by putting his weight where physics wanted it to go anyway. Ben shouted once, and made 3 people remember their names. Grey Wolf arrived without riding hard, and made the last of the 4 decide that bravery was a word for fools who die in groups. They tied the men's hands because rope has a use better than spectacle. They did not kill them because killing is not the kind of math you teach children if you have other sums to show them. Mort had the decency to look tired. He looked at Grey Wolf and at Elias and at the Apache boy and at Jeb, and said the sort of sentence that men say when they have to lay a plank over a gap and walk it before the river can scold them for the way they've strutted. "We'll bring them to town." Town took them like a stomach that knows it has to eat something it doesn't like. The sheriff, who was no one's idea of a brave man, and therefore sometimes provided fairness by accident, when courage would have gotten in the way, took the ropes and the names and did not throw speeches around like flower petals. Mrs. Platt closed the door to her shop because gossip makes bread fall. Calder washed his hammer and then, because he had washed his hammer, washed his hands. And that second wash is the one that saves a man's dignity. Jeb went home with his mother's hand on his shoulder, and a look that will either turn him into someone good or someone careful about being seen. Mort stood in front of the church door a long time without going inside because some thresholds ask you to choose which part of yourself you plan to carry across, and which you plan to leave for the rats. Elias and the boy and old Ben rode back in the long light. The wind played the grass like something that had finally learned a song it liked. When they reached the yard, the house had done that small miracle again. It had remained itself while everything inside the people who used it had altered. Elias unsaddled the mare the way a man unbuttons a shirt after a day's work. The boy set the dipper where it would not clatter. They drank water that tasted like pennies in heaven. They sat on the porch step not because they needed to, but because the day asked them to sit and acknowledge it had happened. Night came on with a gentleness that felt earned. Somewhere, far off, a drum spoke, not a warning, and not a council call, but a thing like a lullaby. It wasn't music. It was the sound of a camp knowing where its children were. Elias felt it in his chest and didn't have to pretend it was something else. The boy said a word that meant the kind of tired that sits in your bones and smiles. Elias repeated it, and it felt good in his mouth. He thought of the next test and then set the thought aside because tests deserve to arrive on their own legs and not be dragged forward by anticipation. He thought of the council's terms, and of the way promises become lighter the more you carry them, if you carry them in front of other people and not only alone. He thought of Grey Wolf's glance that had said, "You will stand here," and understood that here moved as the day demanded, and that standing was sometimes a ride and sometimes a silence, and sometimes a hand on a belt on a ledge above water. He slept because he had earned it, and because not sleeping would have been the sin of pretending he was the only person responsible for keeping fire off the roofs and bandits off the roads, and children out of canyons. The house breathed around him the way houses do that have been told they are allowed to be homes again. The photograph on the shelf tilted a degree to the left because a visiting hand had set it down that way. He left it. He liked that it looked like the people in it were leaning toward the voices in the next room. Toward dawn, a rider came fast the way people come when the thing they thought would not matter has decided it does. The boy woke first because boys who have lived with drums do. Elias woke at the sound of hooves and at the sound of his own name spoken by someone who had learned it without permission. Red Hawk's shadow cut across the yard before his horse did. He did not dismount. He did not waste the day's cool. "Council," he said. The word hit the porch like a stone thrown to the center of a pond. "Tonight, fire." He looked at Elias, and for the first time since they had met in anger, a thing like respect moved under his face. "You will stand there," he said, and pointed at a place only he could see. Elias nodded once, and felt the old ache, and the new duty settle in together, like animals that had finally decided to share a trough. The boy put his palm on the doorframe, as if to steady the house against the truth of what was coming. The desert threw light at them with both hands. Somewhere out in the hush between ridges, a hawk read the day and understood that judging is a kind of flying, and that the ground itself sometimes waits to be told what it has been holding up. They saddled without talk, they rode in the pale, and when the sun had climbed high enough to make promise into glare, they crested the ridge above the place where the council fire would be, and saw in a circle drawn by people who had learned how to make circles mean both beginnings and endings, the gathering that would decide whether all the small mercies they had practiced were enough to raise a larger mercy to its feet. The boy touched the medallion at his chest and then let his hand fall. Elias breathed. The drum counted a space and then filled it. The fire waited for night. The day began to understand what it was for. The fire line they had burned on the Johnson's place had held. This one would have to, too. Only this time, the fuel was older, and the wind was made of men, and the sparks were words. He flexed his hands, found them steady, and told himself the oldest of the country's lessons. You can't stop the wind, but you can learn how to stand in it without letting it turn you into something you won't recognize later. He clicked to the mare, and they went down toward the place where judgment wears smoke like jewelry, and truth takes its seat on a log, and everyone remembers that mercy is not the opposite of strength but the proof of it. Part 5. Ashes and Oaths. Dawn on the day of the council carried a silence that was heavier than storm. The land itself seemed to brace. Elias Carter woke before the first light cracked the east, lying still on his bunk while the boy stirred in the other room. He knew the hours ahead would stretch longer than any fence line, heavier than any stone. He had not been asked to save cattle, or children, or houses from flame. He had been asked to stand where truth and fury and history braided together into a rope strong enough to hang a man, or hold him up. The boy slipped outside, and Elias heard the dipper touch the bucket. The familiar sound folded into the morning, as if to remind them both that simple tasks could still exist in a world about to complicate itself beyond reason. They rode before the sun had climbed, Elias on his mare, the boy steady on the mule. The trail east led them over draws and ridges that glowed pale in the false light. The horizon opened in increments, like a lid lifting on a pot of water that had waited years to boil. They did not speak. Words before judgment are often too light or too heavy. Either way they do not carry well. The boy touched the medallion at his chest once, fingers brief but certain. Elias saw the gesture and kept his eyes on the ridgeline ahead. A man does not need to narrate another man's prayer. At the council ground, the circle had already been made. Fires smoldered low, waiting for night to give them voice. Warriors stood in their places with faces painted or bare, each expression a sentence in a language Elias was still learning. Women stood behind them, not as audience but as spine. Children gathered at the edges, solemn as owls, absorbing the way a people writes its truth. In the center, a log had been dragged to serve as a seat for words that were too heavy to stand on their own. Gray Wolf stood at the far side. He looked as he always looked, steady, carved from wood that would never rot, a man who knew he carried not just his years but those of the dead who had trusted him to use them wisely. Red Hawk stood near him, sharp as flint, restless as wind, a man who believed that fire was not danger but destiny. When Elias and the boy dismounted, the murmur around the circle shifted like grass recognizing the weight of new weather. Some nodded at the boy, recognition softening the edges of suspicion. Others fixed on Elias, their eyes heavy with questions that had waited years for an answer. Old Ben was already there, leaning on his stick, the only white hair in the circle besides Elias's own streaks. He gave Elias the kind of look two men share when they both know they are outnumbered but not out of measure. Mort was there too, jaw set, shame hiding under layers of renewed anger. Jeb fidgeted at his side, guilt and youth warring in his shoulders. Calder stood a step back, hammer strapped to his belt, eyes roaming as if looking for a beam to drive straight. The whole town was here, it seemed, or at least the parts of it loud enough to make themselves matter. The council began not with a speech but with a silence. The drum spoke once, then waited. It spoke again, then waited longer. It spoke a third time, and then the circle breathed as one. Gray Wolf raised his hand and the day agreed to listen. "We have been told," he said, his voice not booming but broad, reaching each ear the way water finds each crack and stone, "that fire walks with men who do not belong to this land. We have been told they burn wagons and cattle, and blame our children for their hunger. We have been told lies have been spoken in town, and carried like arrows into the wind. Today we ask if those lies are to make war, or if they are to be buried with truth. Red Hawk stepped forward before Grey Wolf's hand had lowered. His words came fast, sharp, striking like sparks off steel. They burned. They always burn. For years they have burned our homes, our graves, our names. A wagon is only wood, but the smoke is the same smoke we have tasted since the first plow cut our earth. We speak and they do not listen. We show and they do not see. Mercy is a word they keep in their mouths but not in their hands. How many times will we bend before the world believes we are made of something that cannot break? The murmurs rose like wind in dry grass. The boy at Elias's side stiffened but did not move. Elias kept his hand still against his thighs. He could feel Mort's glare from across the circle, sharp as a thrown nail. He could feel Ben's calm like a small stone held in the pocket, unobtrusive, steady, something to touch when balance trembles. Grey Wolf let the noise swell, then raised his hand again. Words must be given by all sides, he said. His eyes turned to Elias. The circle followed them. The drum fell silent. Elias felt the desert itself lean in. He stepped forward. Not quickly, not slow, but with the deliberate pace of a man who knows every eye will count each stride. I found the boy, Elias said. His voice did not try to be more than it was. At my well, dying of thirst. I gave him water. I gave him bread. He slept in my chair. I did this not because I seek favor, not because I seek trade, not because I fear what you will do if I do not. I did it because a child asked for water, and in this country, thirst is older than war. He let the words sit. He did not hurry to cover them with more. He let the circle decide if they were enough to carry their own weight. The boy stepped forward then. He touched the medallion at his chest and spoke in his own tongue. Voice clear, words unspooled like a rope thrown across a chasm. Elias did not catch each word, but he caught the shape. Water, bread, chair, blanket. He saw the way the people in the circle listened, the way their eyes turned soft where they had been hard, the way their shoulders remembered mercy without being told. Mort barked a laugh, harsh and ill-timed. Mercy? He spat. Tell that to the families who lost cattle, who buried sons. Tell that to the smoke that still hangs over the ridges. This man, he stabbed a finger at Elias. This man plays savior but he is blind. You feed one child while the rest of us starve. Ben's voice cut in, not loud, but sharp enough to catch on ears. Mort, the tracks we saw were not Apache. They were white men. You saw them too. Don't pretend you didn't. Mort flushed, anger and shame sparring. He opened his mouth again but Calder's hand on his arm stopped him. The hammerman, for once, looked unwilling to add weight to a false beam. Grey Wolf spoke. We have heard, he said. We have seen. But words are lighter than ashes. We must weigh them against fire. He turned to Red Hawk. What do you say? Red Hawk's eyes blazed. I say lies burn longer than wood. If we do not strike back, they will come again. They always come again. I say let the circle ride. Let the desert learn our anger. Let the smoke answer their smoke. The crowd stirred, the weight of vengeance thick in the air. Elias felt it pressing against him, hot as noon Sunday. He stepped forward again, this time until he stood in the true center. If you ride tonight, he said, you will not strike the ones who burned. You will strike neighbors, men too foolish to see their own reflection in ash. You will strike children who never set a torch. You will make the lie true, and once a lie becomes true, it can never be undone. The boy spoke again, louder now, his words tumbling, urgent. He pointed at Mort, then at Elias, then at the necklace. He mimed the dipper, the bread, the blanket. His voice carried the memory of thirst quenched and hunger eased. It was not polished rhetoric, it was testimony. And testimony, honest and raw, carries farther than any speech. The circle hushed. Even Red Hawk's fire dimmed a fraction. Grey Wolf looked at his son, then at Elias. He spoke, voice low but iron. Mercy is not weakness. Weakness is forgetting why mercy exists. The boy lives. That is truth. The fire was set by others. That is truth. If we strike without care, we burn truth with lies. That I will not allow. Red Hawk's jaw tightened. He bowed his head, but it was a bow of anger, not surrender. Mort turned away, muttering, but the mutter had lost its teeth. Ben exhaled, slow, as if setting down a stone he had carried too far. Grey Wolf raised his hand a final time. The council is ended. We will watch, we will wait, and if the fire comes again, we will not meet it with blindness. The circle broke. The people moved away in quiet clusters, the way rivers break into streams when they leave a mountain. Elias stood where he was, the boy beside him, until the ground beneath their boots felt like ground again, and not the edge of a cliff. Ben clapped him on the shoulder. "You did it," he said. "No," Elias said. He looked at the boy, at the medallion gleaming faintly in the firelight. He did. The ride home was long but lighter. The stars came out sharp, each one a nail pinning the night to the sky. The boy rode tall on the mule, face lifted toward the constellations. Elias let the silence hold them both. For once, silence did not feel like waiting for judgment. It felt like rest. When they reached the cabin, Elias lit the lamp and set the tin photograph back in its place. He touched it lightly, as always. But tonight, when he looked at the boy settling into the chair, blanket drawn up, he saw not just memory but continuation. He saw not just ghosts but inheritance. And for the first time in longer than he cared to measure, he allowed himself to believe that mercy might last longer than smoke. Outside, far off, a drum sounded once. Not a call to war, not a warning, just a sound, steady and sure, reminding the desert that even here, even now, the heart of a people still beat. Elias closed his eyes. The boy's breathing steadied in the next room, and the house, battered and small and leaning forever against the horizon, breathed with them both, not as a shelter only, but as proof that kindness, when stood for, could hold back the oldest fires the world knew. If the story of Elias Carter and the mercy found at the well has left its mark on your heart, then you understand the true laws of this country. Nothing comes easy in the Wild West, least of all, the truth and forgiveness. But every ordeal overcome, every scar earned in the dust and smoke, proves that kindness can be stronger than fury. Subscribe and ride with me into the next story where justice finds its voice in the silence, where oaths are forged in the ashes, and where hope endures like the steady drumbeat of a people who remember that mercy is the proof of strength.